welcome today. I think the sound should be working. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear okay. And also to find the button to do the thumbs up, you can do thumbs up, thumbs down. I love seeing icons pop up while we're talking because people are either highly engaged or are slipping and hitting random buttons accidentally. Let me mute everybody here just a second. Okay, so if you're wanting to come off, you can come off mute, but I just want to make sure no one does anything accidentally they weren't expecting to do. Okay, so the poll, let me put that right here as we're going. We're going to be talking about Selenium, patterns and anti-patterns. So hopefully if you're using Selenium, this will be useful. If you're looking at using Selenium, it will give you an idea of maybe what to expect, some of the pitfalls. And then we're going to talk about kind of how to grow Selenium from something that maybe works fine if you've got 5 or 6 tests, up to the point that if you've got lots and lots of tests, the things will work very differently with 5 tests than they work when you've got 5,000. So we'll look at that a little bit. I'm also going to I can point you to a sample I have that uses Selenium. It uses Java, but it's kind of a nice thing. I try to keep it somewhat up to date. If you're starting a project, it can be useful to pull down, kind of look at, because I tried to make it use Selenium and Cucumber. And I put as few things in as possible to illustrate what I was trying to do. So it can be a good starting point to kind of just understand or just have something to play with. Okay, first question here. How do you feel about Selenium? Is it like very, very happy over here? I guess that's over here. Or like really, really sad, or just meh in the middle? And there's no right or wrong place to click here. Let me put this link in here one more time. And keep this box up as we go, because we're going to use it for some other things. So how do you feel about Selenium? I'm surprised we don't have some sad faces, but maybe the people that don't like Selenium don't want to come and hear more about it. What I would suggest is that a Java developer or anybody that works with Selenium long enough will experience every single one of these emotions, from the really, really happy to the really, really sad and back and forth, that hopefully end up somewhere over here. But if you've never used it and been really annoyed at Selenium, you just probably have not used it long enough to experience that. So all these emotions are okay. Oh yeah, I wanted to mention, if you have not gotten a copy of my book, I've got a PDF of that. Just reply to one of the invites that you've gotten from me, and I will make sure you get that. There's some other ways to get it too. Also, this is my channel on YouTube. This is the one that has all the cartoons on it. You should be able to find it. If not, email me. I'm happy to send that to you as well. Next week, we're doing something a little bit different. I'm going to possibly be on the road. So we're going to premiere a video about Agile Principle number 3 that we haven't, I think I've used it with a small group of people before, but it hasn't been live up on the YouTube channel. So we're going to premiere it at this time next week. So if that sounds interesting, it'll be like 15 minutes long. So it'll be kind of a shorter episode. I should be on, but if I hit a dead spot or something while we're driving, I wanted to make sure this should run even if I get kicked off. Okay, so let's talk about Selenium. That's what everybody came for. Okay, so Selenium, what is Selenium? Well, this question can be a lot more confusing than it sounds like, because Selenium can be a lot of different things, because there's lots of different pieces of it. So Selenium WebDriver is what we're mainly going to be talking about here. And what it does is it is an interface between your programming language and being able to control a browser. And that's the main thing we're going to be talking about here. But there are some other things that are called Selenium as well. Selenium IDE, this is an example of what that looks like. It's a way you can actually record what you're doing and then play it back. And on first blush, this sounds really, really great. Like, look at all the stuff we'll be able to do if we can just record it instead of writing out the code. In actual practice, I find this is not nearly as useful as it sounds. The place I have found it useful is if you're trying to do some type of complex interaction using Selenium IDE to figure out how it grabs the particular things off the page, like how it will identify them. Sometimes those are useful, and this will spit out an HTML version, but you can also export Java and maybe even C# from it as well. So that's another thing that is called Selenium and part of Selenium group of offerings. There's also Selenium Grid. Selenium Grid is a way to be able to run Selenium in one place, but have a control browser somewhere else, including controlling multiple browsers. So this is another piece. We're not going to be talking about that. Another very, very valuable piece, particularly if you're trying to scale things up and maybe run more things in parallel. Okay, so question for you. I'll put this in the chat one more time here. Also, if you can't get to it from the chat up there at the top, it's polev.com, markshed434. It's got the 434 at the end because I wasn't willing to spend the extra money to not have 3 digits at the end of it. So go to that and keep this up as we go. Are you using Selenium on your project? So we've got about half of us are saying yes, we use it today. And then the other maybe half, a little more than half, are saying no, we're probably not going to use it anytime soon, or no, but we're interested in you. And then about 7% saying that it's something you're maybe interested in using soon. Okay, so let's look at Selenium WebDriver. So conceptually, I've got a live demo I'm going to do here too in a little bit, but let's just think about how it works. So I'm going to be talking about everything from the standpoint of Java. This works very similar if you're using another programming language. You're not limited to Java, but that's just what my examples are going to be here. So Selenium looks something like this. We have Java, or whatever programming language we're writing stuff in, and that's where like our JUnit will be, or whatever our testing framework is going to be over in the Java land, Cucumber, whatever. And that will use excuse me, the Selenium API. And Selenium will control a driver for whatever browser we're trying to use. And what I'm going to be showing you here is Chrome, but it will work with other browsers as well. So there's a Chrome driver executable that actually lets us talk to Chrome and remote control Chrome. So this is the stack that needs to be there. Now, a common thing, if you're getting started with Selenium and you're trying to do it and set it up, this is really easy to miss that you need the Chrome driver executable. And sometimes the error messages it gives you don't make it really, really clear that, hey, you need this other part. You think you've got Selenium, it should work, but you need the driver for whatever browser you're trying to use. That's an important piece to have as well. Another thing that, and this didn't used to be the case years and years ago, but you've also got to make sure that your machine has permission to execute the Chrome driver. That's something that sometimes you get into situations where you've got some type of security that's saying, hey, you download this from the internet and you haven't told me it's okay to run. And depending on how it tries to execute, it may not pop up on the screen saying, are you sure you want to do it? So it can lead to some weird error messages where things aren't running the way that you would expect them to. So those are just some things to watch out for if you're setting up something like this. So let's look at what this looks like. So here is a very, very simple Selenium example. And all this is going to do is it's going to come up, it's going to get a web driver, it's going to get the Chrome driver, and then it's going to load Google. So up here at the top, what we've got going on is we're setting up and telling it where the Chrome driver is. In this case, I think there's some default locations you can put in. I usually try to specify it. And as you can see, and we'll see in a little bit, I like to actually put the Chrome driver in the project. So everybody's using the same thing and we're not dealing with, it works on this computer, but not another because they forgot to install the driver. There's other ways to approach it, but that's what I found useful. Then what we're doing here on the second line of this method is we're actually instantiating the Chrome driver. We're creating a new one of those. And there's much more complicated ways you can do this, but this will just give you an idea of how the pieces work. And then the WebDriver.get, and we pass it in a string that's a URL. So these are, this will load Google for us. So this is a typical look at the very simplest thing we can do of just loading a web page. And we haven't even checked for anything on the web page. But let's look at another slightly more complicated example. So in this case, what we're actually doing is we've got a page that has an addition, it's calculator on it. And it's got a box for putting one number in, a box for putting another number in, and a button to add the numbers together. And then we're going to check for the results. So in this case, what we're doing is we're still doing the same thing of setting up all, in the first 3 lines, we're just setting stuff up on the first 2 lines. In the 3rd line, we're actually getting the page. In this case, it's running a local host. We don't know what server port it's going to be on, so we're actually loading up that server port. And then what we're doing is we're finding that first element. We're finding the thing that says adder first number. So whatever has that particular ID on it. And we're sending keys to it. We're sending the number 6 to it right here. So that's going to do the same thing that would happen is if we clicked on that box and typed the number 6. Then we do the same thing for the next box and we add the number 4 to it, which will do the same thing as if we clicked on the box. It's just remote controlling Selenium to make it work. And then the next thing right here, on this line right here, what we're doing is we're finding the button and we're clicking it. So you see we've got WebDriver find element by the ID, and we call it the adder button, and then we click on it. And then once we're done with that, we're going to assert that the number 10, so that's what we expect to get, is what we get if we parse the integer that we get when we call WebDriver.findElement and find this ID right here, the results, and get the text from it. Now, as you can see, there's some things we have to do here, like parsing the integer, because we're going to get back a string, but we're comparing it to a 10. We've got to actually get the text from this. It's not a matter of just finding the element, you've got to get the text. These aren't really, so it may look a little bit strange. You get used to them, and if you start using page objects, you'll actually insulate yourself from a lot of this. Oh yeah, Andy, that's a good point. Me executing it to make from the command line just to make sure it can find everything. Okay, so let's talk about the WebDriver philosophy, because this can cause a lot of confusion sometimes. And the WebDriver philosophy is if a user can't do it on the web page, Selenium won't do it either. So there's lots of things, and this doesn't sound like a big deal, but it turns out there's lots of things that you will want to do in testing that you can't actually do with Selenium because it's not something you can actually do directly from a web page. For example, a common thing I've seen is situations where you need to actually inject something into the header for security reasons just to test stuff. Selenium will not let you do that. Now, there are ways to make it work. You can set up a proxy and inject into the proxy, and there's things you can do. But Selenium has decided that their philosophy is this should be things that the user can actually do from the web page. So there's lots of stuff that you would expect, that you might expect to find in Selenium that's actually not there. And like I said, there's other ways to do it. And if you're in a case where you need to inject something into the header, I think I've got a sample up online of how to do that, or one way to do it that's worked for some of the teams. So question for you here, how did Selenium get its name? Yes, Astrid's point about the site you want to do things needs to be accessible from the machine your code runs on. That can be, when you start putting stuff into running on CI/CD, that can sometimes get pretty tricky, because I've been in situations where it was deployed here, our laptops could get to it here, but for some reason CI/CD was not allowed to talk to that location, and we had to find other ways to run it. Let me add a link here again. How did Selenium get its name? So we've got A, it was created by a developer who had formerly been a chemistry teacher. B, the creators were heavy users of Selsun Blue shampoo with Selenium, so they had bad dandruff evidently. C, the creators liked the fact it will bind with mercury. Or D, they randomly pointed out a word in the dictionary. Okay, it looks like some of people are familiar with the history of Selenium. So mercury used to be the name of a product. I think it was eventually bought by HP, but it was a testing tool that was the primary competitor to Selenium when Selenium started up as open source. So if you get mercury poison, what they do is they give you Selenium, because Selenium will bind with the mercury and help get it out of your body. So Selenium was the antidote to mercury poisoning, and mercury was the competitor product, so that's why they called it Selenium. Anyway, I thought it was a funny little bit of history of how it got its name. Okay, now let's talk about patterns. So hopefully that gave you kind of a good overview, and we're going to look at it in more detail in a minute. We'll actually go through and look at an example application. But let's talk about some patterns. Well, one pattern you want to do is having some type of central configuration. What I just showed you, we were creating a new, everything needed set up was just built into that individual test. You probably want that to be injected somehow into the test you run, so you're not having to create a new WebDriver every time. Because when you create a new WebDriver, it's actually going to bring up your web browser again. You may want to reuse that. One of the reasons you may want to reuse it is for faster startup times, but the even bigger reason you want to reuse it is so if you've got 5,000 tests, you don't end up with 5,000 browsers open and possibly sticking around and using up all your memory. So having some type of central configuration, this also becomes very, very important if you get in a situation where you've got maybe the URL changed. So be thinking through some of those things of how do we organize this stuff so we can find it later. In fact, I'm going to show you an example here of what central configuration might look like. So here is a simple project, and I can send you guys a link to this if anyone wants to see this. So here's the central configuration we have on this very simple project. What we've done here, and this is using Spring. See, we've decided where the driver is for Mac and where it is for Windows, and we could add Linux to it as well. We've made sure we've got a singleton to get the WebDriver. Here we've got a thing that will choose between it being Windows or the Mac, and then we set the property for it, and then we return the new Chrome driver. So by having noted, this isn't spread out in every single test. This is in a centralized location, so everybody writing tests is all getting their WebDriver from here. If we need to update something, it can all happen here. Let's see if we've got anything down here. Okay, yeah, and that's the configuration we have here. So this is very, very simple. Now, one of the interesting things that can happen here is if you get to the point where you do need to inject something and you need to set up a proxy or something like that, once you've got this in place, this is where you would actually handle making that part of your configuration. Let's see. As a matter of fact, I may just go through my slides and I'll show. Okay, so page objects. Oh, no, I need to show you these. Okay, so the next pattern that I want to mention is page objects. So give me a thumbs up if you're familiar with the page object pattern. Anyone familiar with that? Seen that before? Okay, some people have. So a page object, instead of the examples that I just showed, our test knew all the details of everything that was on the page. Remember that thing we looked at? Matter of fact, let's look at one here. Let me bring up some code. Okay, so here is a simple test. Let's see, I've got one here. Yeah, the simple but hard to maintain test, okay? So in this case, notice this is the example that we talked about earlier, and it's got all the details of everything on the page. It knows what the IDs are for everything it needs to talk to. It knows what the name of the button is. All those things are inside of the test itself. What the page object pattern does is says, if we build something like this, and we've got a bunch of tests that have all this information embedded in them, when we need to change something on the page, we may have hundreds of places that we need to go through and change. Like, let's say this page becomes more generic, and now instead of adding numbers, you can also multiply numbers or subtract numbers or whatever else it is. Well, we might want to change that the name of that element from adder first number to operation first number, or something a little bit more generic. If I've built this information into thousands and thousands of pages, I'm going to have to go through all of them and change it. Or what's likely to happen is I may not be willing to change it, and I may not rename it, even though this name is old and doesn't actually represent what it is. So if I approach the programming like this, it's likely to make it to where my application becomes more brittle and my tests make it so it is harder to change things. And in all of our testing, however we're testing our application, the goal is to make it easy to change things in the future. And if I start doing stuff like this, I'm going to build things into my tests in ways that make it very, very difficult to change in the future. And that's what we want to avoid. We want our tests to enable change, not be the thing that keeps us from being able to change stuff. So what the page object pattern does is it says, what if we take all this information here, all the details about the page, and let's move it out into something that represents just the page. So if we ever need to change this stuff, there's only one place that it has to change. So from a diagram, it looks something like this. So the test I just showed you was like this. So we've got a test that has knowledge of the UI. And what we want to do is insert a page object in between here in order to make it to where our test doesn't have to know anything about the UI and can focus more on the intent of what the user is trying to do. So if you notice here, this doesn't have any of the IDs or anything like that. We've got just demo, go to the demo page, okay? It doesn't even tell us what the URL is of the demo page, just there's going to be some type of page and we're going to be able to go to it. And then we're going to add the numbers, 5 and 5. Now notice that's very much based on the intent of what we're trying to do. And then we're going to assert that the adder results equal the actual intent. And remember all that stuff where we had to get text and we had to convert it to an integer? That all gets abstracted away behind just the intent of we're wanting to get the addition results. And if we build it like this, it gives us a lot of flexibility to change things in the future. And if you've ever been on a project that uses test and they're expecting to get faster and faster because they've got really invested heavily in tests, but instead it becomes harder and harder to change things, one of the reasons that can happen is because they're not properly abstracting their tests. And they're assuming the tests don't need the same level of engineering effort and thought that the rest of the application does, which in some ways might be true. But if you build your tests in a way that make it hard to maintain the application, you're going to slow yourself down. So we'll look at an example of this a little bit later. But notice the difference here. In this case, my test knows everything about the page. In this case, my test is focused on the actual intent, and this page object represents all the knowledge about how the page works. One of the things when I'm working with teams and we're going through this, I usually try to get them to think in terms of this, the way this looks should be a little bit generic of what the user interface is. So if I was working with something that wasn't a page, let's say I was working with a interface to some type of smart device, Alexa or something like that. This still would mostly make sense, right? You know, I'm going to somehow launch this thing, whatever it is, and I'm going to add these two numbers, and then we make sure the results I got were equal. So if you're thinking in terms of how do I make my if I make my tests in a way that are focused on the intent, it should work if it was happening on a smartwatch, on a web page, on a smart speaker device, or any of those types of things. Okay, next tip, abstraction. One of the things when we're thinking about tests is we're probably going to need to think about our tests, particularly as we're dealing with Selenium, at different levels of abstraction. So the thing that comes to mind when I think of this is when I was working on my master's degree in music. It was one of the last thing I did was wrote a full orchestral piece. Things about 15 minutes long or so. It's probably on the shelf over there or something. But one of the interesting experiences in doing this, because I was also doing some software engineering at the time, was I realized that I was having to think about the music in a very similar way to how I was thinking about the software I was writing. And sometimes I'd be thinking about the music in terms of like the overall theme that was happening over this big long section. And other times I was thinking about how is this particular note going to be played, something, you know, really, really low. And when you're testing stuff, you probably want to be thinking in you're going to have to jump back and forth between the levels of abstraction of having some tests that test things at a very high level of abstraction, and then other tests that test things at a very low level of abstraction. And it might seem that that might be the unit tests are low level abstraction and the UI tests are high level of abstraction, but sometimes that's not always the case. You may sometimes need to have things that are touching the UI that are doing things at a fairly low level of abstraction just to make sure all the pieces work together. Okay, next pattern, independent tests. We want independent tests. We do not want interdependent tests. When we say independent tests, our tests should be able to run in any order. So if your tests have to run in a particular order, they are interdependent tests. That means that this test has to do something that this other test has to take advantage of. So that means each test is going to need to do its own setup. Now, that doesn't mean you may have some type of setup that needs to happen for running all of your tests, but that's different than having a situation where test 1 needs to fire off before test 2 fires off, and if I fire off test 2 first, then if I fire off test 2 first, then it will fail. So we want to have these things as independent as possible. This can be very difficult to do. A couple of ways that I know that help to do it is if you're used to actually running a subset of your tests locally and others on the server, that kind of helps push you to making them more independent. Because if there were prerequisites that had to happen, you're going to discover them. The other thing that in most situations I found is helpful is actually distributing your test across multiple runners. If your tests depend on each other, that type of situation is going to break all kinds of things. So sometimes if you're setting up a project, sometimes thinking about those situations that you're going to get to when you get big and how you can maybe start bring them to the front so you can start experiencing them if they drive good behavior. So if there's things that you know you're going to have to do in the future that if you were to start in your process now will help ensure that you don't create interdependent tests, those might be things worth considering bringing forward. Parallel capabilities. Okay, so this is another issue that can be kind of challenging. The idea of trying to run our tests, being able to run tests in parallel. Now, if you're able to set up complete independent instances, you know, you take your application, you bring it up on 10 independent places with their independent database and everything's independent, that can be a lot easier to do. It's not that big a deal of running stuff parallel. But if you're trying to run things in parallel and it's going to be either sharing the database or maybe in the web server or all those things, this can get really, really, really tricky. Because if I go in and I say, I want to create a user, I'm going to create a user Joe, and then I'm going to do this with it, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to delete Joe out of the database. But there's another test that's running at the same time that needed to create Joe. It saw Joe was already there, and then it goes try to upgrade Joe to a paid account. And right when it gets ready to do that, this other test deletes Joe, and he's not there anymore. That's going to cause all kinds of problems. So you want to be thinking of how to create your tests in Selenium, well, all of your testing, in a way that actually, in a way that's independent. So this test, this really comes back to the independent and interdependent issues. If I have a test, I should be able to run that test independent of everything else, even if that same test is running at the same time. And when you start thinking about it like that, that gets really, really tricky, right? Because if I've got this test that's creating Joe and then going to delete Joe, and I've got that same test running at the same time, and one of them deletes it before the next one deletes it, then that test fails. The way to get around that is often by randomizing pieces of your test. So in this case, instead of creating Joe, we might create Joe and then a random number at the end of it. And I've worked on some teams that have really, really embraced this, and they were able to do some really incredible things. As a matter of fact, they built into their process to where everything had a little bit of a random number attached to it that they did. So their tests could all run, in theory, all their tests could run simultaneously, or all their tests could run, you could run 100 copies of the exact same test at the exact same time, and everyone would act completely independently because they were randomized in such a way that there were no collisions. So this, as I explained through this, this is something that if you haven't experienced this before, it probably isn't going to make a lot of sense. If you have experienced this before, it probably makes complete sense because you've experienced the pain that goes along with not being able to do this. So having some way of being able to run stuff in parallel, the tests being able to run in parallel without stepping on each other's toes. And there's the mechanisms of running things in parallel. There's lots of different ways to do that. I've seen some really good things done with JUnit, starting up the tests inside of containers, to where you've got JUnit running multiple things at the same time, starting stuff up inside of containers, and being able to take stuff that would take an hour to run and getting it down to 20 minutes on the exact same hardware just because it's running more stuff in parallel. It's easy to overlook how much time it takes to bring up a browser and click through stuff, particularly when you get into thousands and thousands of tests. Okay, so let's talk about failures with Selenium. And I want to suggest that if you are using Selenium, you're going to have you're going to have problems with your tests. You're going to have things that cause the test to fail. And it's not a matter of if, but when. And this is one thing I've seen a lot of teams kind of get frustrated with, is if they go into the idea thinking, go into a project thinking, if we get really good at Selenium, it will run 100% of the time and nothing will ever go wrong. That's not true. You're going to have problems with it. What's going to happen sometimes is your WebDriver is going to be talking to Selenium, and Selenium is just going to shut down for some reason, or the browser is just going to shut down. It's going to lose that connection. So you're going to have different types of failures when you're dealing with when you're dealing with Selenium. But there are different types of failures, right? There are flaky tests where sometimes this returns 5 and sometimes it returns 6, and I get the same result if I go in and do it from the web page, and it's not, the system does not behave the same way all the time. That's an issue with either your system is bad or your tests have interdependencies or those types of things. In those types of situations, you need to fix your tests. If you're dealing with situations where Selenium may occasionally come to a page, and even if it's working, it can't find the ID on it because it gets there before the web server returns it and it times out. Those types of things are going to happen. There are ways to set up retries. I know JUnit supports this and it can work really well, where you say, okay, all these Selenium tests that are, Selenium is Huffy from time to time. All these tests that are going to run, I need each of them. I'm willing to try each one up to 5 times before I declare that it's broken. And on one hand, that sounds awful, but if you're doing that for your Selenium test, you probably need that level of confidence, or you need that level of retry, because there are lots of things that can potentially go wrong. And if you're dealing with a build that has 5,000 tests in it, even if there's a very small percentage that Selenium might something might happen and Selenium might time out, and you don't actually have a way of retrying just that specific test, you get into a situation where it becomes normal to look at your build and say, it failed, but it's probably not a big deal. We're just going to go beyond it. And then you get into the situation where no one's paying attention to whether things passed or not. So having some type of mechanism to retry stuff is very, very important. And it's going to take some effort. You're going to have to start building things that instead of just going to, I click on this button and then I go to look at the results, you may have to click on the button, go wait and see if the results have come up or not, and then look at the results. And there's lots of things like that over time you'll have to build. Now, page objects make this a lot less painful because once you build it into the page object, then any test that uses that can actually make use of those types of weights and things like that. But a lot of teams go in thinking that Selenium is going to be really, really easy, but particularly early on, Selenium will probably consume more of your development efforts than the actual application. Now, over time, it becomes very, very well worth it as you build things. But when you're starting from scratch, there's going to be lots of things you're going to learn about your particular application that you're going to have to learn how to work around and how to deal with these particular timeouts and this particular framework that's doing things on the UI standpoint. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so now I wanted to switch over and take a look at actually doing something here. So here's our simple but harder to maintain test. And what I want to do here is I'm going to run this in debug so it goes slowly so we can see what's actually happening here. So let me run this and it should launch and then pause. Okay. So this will give, if you haven't seen Selenium before, hopefully this will be an interesting way to see exactly what we've been talking about here. So that was all theory, here's practice. Okay, so what we've done so far is it looks like we've created a driver, we've gotten a driver, we've come to the first thing that's supposed to load the page, but we've paused on that. So here's our copy of Chrome that opened. So I'm going to then take a step here, I'm going to step over this. And now it loaded the page. So if you see there up at the top, it's got a random number that's the port that it's running on, because this uses a random number for the port. And now the next thing I'm going to do here is, let me see if I make this bigger. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is find that adder first number. Scroll down here so you can see. So here's my first number and second number. I'm going to find those, and I'm going to send, I think it was the number 4 to it. Drag this over just a little bit for us. So I've got that. Okay, if I do this, I can't see it. Okay, so I'm going to step over this. Okay, so if you see, and send the number 5 to it, I mean. So we just sent the keys 5 to that first box. Now, this is doing the same thing as if I had notice the box is active. This is doing the same thing as if I had clicked on it and then type the number here. There are testing frameworks that kind of skip that and they mess directly with the DOM and put stuff into it. And there are some advantages of doing that, but it's not testing the same thing as testing, here's if a user clicks this and then does this. Because if you look up here, I'm finding that element and then I'm sending the keys to it. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is send a 5 to the next box. So now I've added a 5 to that next box there. So now what we're going to do is, remember I was talking about the weighting? I'm going to first create a weight, web element weight, I think is what I'm doing here. And I'm saying I want to wait at least 10 seconds until this ID adder result appears. So this is where I'm insulating myself from a situation where it may take a few seconds to show up for some reason. Now, maybe it normally happens instantaneously, but I've got to deal with the worst case scenario. It may work fine on my machine, but once I get in CI/CD, maybe it's on slower hardware, and it would fail there. Or Bob's computer isn't as fast, and when he runs these tests, we need to make sure that they pass. So I've got to wait here, and so I'm going to do that. Okay, and then I'm going to click, I think this is where I actually click on the, oh no, okay, I'm sorry, I skipped this one. We clicked on the add button. Now we're on the wait, and it's going to wait until the results appear down there at the bottom. So if you see there's a 10 there. And now we're going to assert that the results of what we are waiting on equal 10. So let me step that. Okay, and now I've got, okay, actually I just want to play through to the end now because otherwise it's going to get into the framework stuff. So I run this. Okay, there it is. My test has passed. Now, that was really, really slow. Let me show you what it looks like if we don't do it in debug mode. So I'm going to play, starting up Spring. There we go. Then it's done. So, and you may not have even seen it, but it did bring up Chrome and went through it really quickly. So that's what that's what's happening here. So as I mentioned, this is this is not the way we would want our test to be designed. So let's look at this other one. Okay, so this test right here, a simple test. Note this tests the exact same thing, but notice how much easier this is to read than the one we had down here at the bottom. So if I go into this one and run it here, so I'm going to run that, and notice it should go through. Okay, so it did the exact same thing as what we just saw. Well, let's step into this one. Okay, but the page objects is what I was wanting to show us here. Sorry. Okay. Off just a little bit. Okay, so right here, I'm going to this page object. So let's see what's actually in this go method. So here there's a go method. Well, this looks exactly like what I was using in my other test, right? It's going to go to this local port. And it is exactly like it, but every time I want to use something on this page, now I just need to call go instead of having that information embedded in every single one of my tests. So let's look at the rest of the page object here. So the next thing I do, whoops. Okay, so then I'm going to add numbers. So let's look at that method here. So in the add numbers, I'm actually doing the same thing I did a little bit earlier. I'm sending the keys to it, and I'm clicking on the adder button to add it. Exact same code behind it, but I'm abstracting this in a way that if I need to add thousands and thousands of numbers, I'm not repeating the details of the page in multiple places. If I ever need to change one of these IDs, I can come here and change it just right here without having to go in all these different places to changing it. And then let's look at the final thing. So the assert equals, we're saying demo page get adder results. And if I go into that, I've now got my weight and those things embedded into here. Now, one thing here, if for some reason we need to change the way that the weight works, like assume we've got thousands of tests out here, we change the weight right here and it'll work for any test that actually deals with getting the addition results. So that's what a demo page, or what it's called demo page. This is what the page object looks like. So let me show you, see if there's anything else in here. There's some things. If you're interested in the details of this, let me know. I'd be happy to send you. This is up on GitHub. You can download it and play with it. But here's the demo page. This is where we actually handle starting up the WebDriver, or rather getting the singleton WebDriver to do things with it. There's the go, there's the add numbers, and then here's the get adder results. This is for some other stuff that's on that page. Okay, so that's the gist of how Selenium works. Let me see if anybody's got any questions. Okay, so let me, I'll tell you what, let me get that right. I know what I'll do. I'm going to, let me go back to the project. Okay, because we need to give away a shirt here. So questions from the Selenium talk. I'm going to go through this while I find, so you guys can participate in this while I find the link for that GitHub, and I'll put it in the chat there. And so bring this up. And also, if anything I mentioned, you're like, I'd like to see an example of that, feel free to email me, because I may have snippets somewhere else too that aren't necessarily just in this project. So while you guys are joining the poll in order to compete for a lovely t-shirt, or one of the others, depending on what sizes we have, let me grab this for you. So go ahead and join that. And I will paste this right here. Okay, here is the link to that that demo. Okay, everybody ready? 3, 2, 1. Why did the creators call it Selenium? Was it because they didn't realize it was used in dandruff shampoo? Was it because it would bind with mercury? Or to make fun of HP? Or it was hard for competitors to say? Why did the creators call it Selenium? Answers in. Very good. And it was because it would bind with mercury. To make fun of HP is almost the right answer, but mercury was not owned by HP at the time, I believe. So they weren't even HP wasn't on the radar. It was later sold to HP. Okay, so we've got Bob, Chris, Shane, Simon, Wayne, and a bunch of guests. Good job. Next question. What part of Selenium do you use to control the browser? Is it the browser controller, 9-iron, web flux capacitor, web controller, or web driver? Which part of Selenium do you use to control the browser? Get your answers in. And 2 seconds remaining. And it is the web driver. The web driver is the driver that controls whatever browser you're using. No one voted for web flux capacitor. I'm kind of disappointed, but okay. Top score is still Chris, followed by Simon, a bunch of guests, Wayne, and a bunch more guests. Very good. What did Mark suggest your testing code should talk to? Should your testing code talk to nothing? There should be separation of concerns. Your testing code should talk to the user interface. Your testing code should talk to units, or your testing code should talk to page objects. What did I suggest your testing code should talk to? Particularly within the scope of a Selenium. Yes, page objects. So user interface, you'll want to be driving the user interface, but I'm suggesting having a page object abstraction between the test code and the user interface will make your life much more easier and avoid much pain and suffering. Chris, still in top spot, followed by Simon, guest, Wayne. What type of tests do we want? Interpersonal test, interdependent test, international test, or independent test? What's the pattern that we're wanting to look for in testing is having what type of test? Of these tests, what type do we want? 2 seconds remaining. We've got 21 people have answered, and independent test. I'm sorry. Interdependent test means that they depend on each other. And yes, these are hard because they all sound very similar. We do not want tests that have to rely on other tests in order to pass. We don't want them to be interdependent. We want them to be independent or separate from each other. You ought to be able to run any test in any order and any tests at the same time, hopefully, without having them step on each other's toes. Chris still has the top spot. Man, Chris is on a roll here, followed by Dustin, Simon, Wayne, and a bunch of guests in there as well. What was one thing that Mark suggested could help with making tests run in parallel? Was it adding random stuff? Adding random numbers to stuff? He said never to try to run tests in parallel, using the same names for all inputs, or doing setup in one test that is used by other tests. And I will give you a hint. This is exactly what you do not want to do because that creates interdependent tests. Yes, adding random number to things. If we add random numbers to like the IDs that we're using, the names that we're using, we make those tests to where they're completely separate from each other. In fact, I was talking to the makers of Jira years ago, and they said by randomizing stuff, they didn't have to do as much teardown. So they would have a big database, all their tests would run against it. And since they had random numbers for, their test might create a user and then do all these things with the user under that user's account, they didn't actually have to tear it down every time because the next time that came along, it would be a completely new test with a completely different user since it had the random number attached to it. So they would run their database and just clear it out every month or so, and it saved them a lot of time. Add the date and time down the millisecond. That way you can see when the test was run. That's cool. Okay, Crystal's top spot, followed by Dustin, Simon, 2 guests, Wayne, and a bunch more guests. What is the Selenium philosophy? Is it live long and prosper, like a user but a robot, all the things all the time, or if a user can't do it, we won't either? What is the Selenium philosophy? And this has a lot of some big implications for how Selenium was designed. And yes, if a user can't do it, we won't either. So you'll find things that you would expect to be able to do that you can't because because Selenium will only do things that you can do through the browser. It has some big implications when you're trying to deal with security. And very good, Chris took the top spot. Very good, Chris. Chris, if you send me a screenshot, or I'll note you. Let me know what size you want and where to send it, and we will get a t-shirt headed your way. Either one of these or one of the turn your video on ones, depending on which sizes you need. So, Chris, thank you for coming. Oh, next, you already have one. Okay, Dustin. Dustin, are you? Hopefully, you're still here, Dustin. So, Chris is passing it on to you, passing it forward. So, Dustin, send me an email and let me know what size shirt you want, and your just reply to anything that I've sent out. Size shirt. I think I've got these in small, medium, and large, and I've got the other ones in every size. So, give me a size and what you want, and we will get it headed your way later this week. Okay, so that covers what I was wanting to cover. Please do take a moment to fill out the feedback, but I wanted to leave some time at the end for any questions, particularly if we want to take a look at it. If you have any questions, because we can probably bring it up in code and look at it if it's something technical, if I've got it in my example. So any questions, thoughts, aggravations? And if any of you are going to be at KCDC tomorrow or Thursday, be looking for me. I'm going to be speaking there, and I'd love to say hi.